And this is part 2 of our screencast on the end of the year review. So let's get going. Chapter 5 is all about the evolutionary changes and how that leads to species diversity and what that means for ecosystems. And so remember, we talk about biodiversity in terms of not just species biodiversity, but also genetic biodiversity. And so from your biology background, you need to be familiar with the terms DNA, chromosome, gene, allele. We barely covered it, again, just because you know this from biology. If you don't, just look it up on Wikipedia, but you should know those from your basic biology in 9th grade. Okay, so what we're talking about here with biodiversity and genetic diversity as it pertains to evolution is that individual species are going to have mutations, and those mutations could be naturally occurring or they could be caused by mutagens, but it's something that has changed the DNA. It could be a normal variation, for example, albinism, somebody who is an albino. We see the same type of effect. I can't pronounce it. It starts with an L, but that's how you get a white alligator, and it's an absence of pigmentation is all that is. So again, that happens normally as a variation in the genetic code. You can also have exposure to chemicals that would cause mutations. We've talked about a lot of teratogens is what we would call them, some chemicals that again have an effect on your DNA and your reproductive system. UV radiation can even cause mutation. Remember that UV and the electromagnetic spectrum is very high energy, and so just like X-rays and gamma rays can cause mutations, so can UV rays. And again, radiation, just like I just said, on the electromagnetic spectrum. And so remember that in order to pass down a mutation, a genetic trait, it has to be in your DNA. If I lost a finger in a tire changing accident, the children that I had in the future would still be born with the correct number of fingers. However, if I had a genetic trait that caused me to have, I don't know, 6 fingers instead of 5, then there's a possibility that I could pass that down. So again, remember that genetic traits are the only ones that we're going to be worried about here in evolution. So why do species change over time? Okay, so first off, they just have random mutations, and then there's some type of pressure in the environment that puts resistance on the population, and it selects for those individuals who are best equipped to handle the new situation. So you see those two things there, environmental resistance and biotic potential. Biotic potential being that concept that rabbits can reproduce way faster than can panda bears. Selective pressure, again, what we're going to see is that the survival of the fittest maintains. Now, fitness, again, doesn't mean you have to be the strongest, you don't have to be the fastest, but you might. It totally depends on what species you are. In human species, it tends to be who's the richest or who's the handsomest, but that's not everybody. So with gorillas, we tend to see things like the strongest of the silverbacks. I'm trying to think of other ones, with a cheetah, it might be the fastest one. So it just totally depends on how species will select their mate. There's birds that have to build pretty nests with lots of things that are blue, and that's how they get chosen. So what we end up with is speciation. Over time, if there is the correct selective pressure, if survival of the fittest maintains, then over time a new species will come about, and that's based on what we call reproductive isolation. Now, that means that that particular species is only reproducing in a specific gene pool. Typically, this has to do with geographic isolation, meaning that they can't actually come in contact anymore. But that's not always the case. Okay, so reproductive isolation, you could just simply choose that, any guy that's over 7 feet tall will no longer be included in the gene pool. And if everybody subconsciously decided that, then you start to change your species. Again, it's hard to throw humans in there because we're a little bit different in terms of how we choose things and what it means to be fit. Speciation, though, this is the idea of Darwin, and so he saw this going to the Galapagos Islands, and he realized that what had occurred is over time the islands had become separated, and so a single species had become different species that ended up looking incredibly different, but you could still tell that there was a single ancestral organism that started things off. He talked about his finches and how their beaks would change depending on the plants that were around. The one that I always like to think about is the difference in the flightless birds that we see. Tends to be flightless birds are going to be in Australia, Africa, and South America. And there's the large ones like the ostriches, the emus, and the rheas, or there's smaller ones like you've got, ooh, what is that called? Oh, it's a funny looking one that's kind of mean in Australia. I totally forget the name now, but anyway, those three major birds you can tell are all from the same ancestral line, but have been speciated. They've become their own unique species because of reproductive isolation. Okay, so some geological context for that. Again, a lot of times we need to move apart from the other species in order to ensure that there's reproductive isolation. So plate tectonics allows for that separation. You need to know your geological time scale. It comes up with things like plate tectonics, with evolutions and extinctions. Remember with evolution that we see an explosion of life around the beginning of the Cambrian era. Our first geological era is going to be the Precambrian. That lasts a long time and basically is demarcated by when life starts to really explode and evolution starts to take over. And so again, that flows in with the geologic time scale. Selective breeding, this is something that is what humans have been doing for centuries to make sure that we get certain characteristics and traits in domesticated species, whether it be dogs that we've bred down in size or that we've bred to be watchdogs and very alert, or it could be crops. We have selectively bred crops so that they are more drought tolerant, so that they have larger ears of corn. Whatever the species is, we have found a way to selectively breed them by choosing the individuals that will reproduce together. Again, we do this through artificial selection because we're doing the choosing, not the actual organisms, and that is very different than natural selection. So something like a Chihuahua is not meant to be in nature, but something like a wolf or a coyote very much is. Okay, chapter 6 and 7 dealt with the human population. Again, the chapters are completely different in our book. In our book, this is, I think, just chapter 6. But we looked at the different topics that are on here, and so we're going to start to go through them. But these are definitely things that you want to make sure that you know about, especially those calculations as it relates to FRQs that you might be given. Demographic transition is always a tricky topic and worth going over again. And if you've forgotten your age structure, for all means, go and look back at age structure. And there's a lot to be said about fertility rates. Okay, so first off, a couple of equations that you need to be familiar with. First off, our population growth rate equation. And it starts off with this slide just very, very simple. Your rate is equal to the births minus the deaths. But we know that that's not the only thing going on. If we want to talk about global population, yeah, that's it, because it doesn't matter where you move, you're still on the globe. But typically we're talking about countries, and so we have to worry about the people who come in and out. Make special note in parentheses there, underneath growth rate, it says if the number is negative, your population is shrinking. It makes sense. If there are more deaths than births, then your population would be shrinking. Again, though, we also have to worry about the people who are coming in and the people who are exiting. And so I always call this in-migration because the word in means coming in, and it looks a little bit better than, for me, I can't say very differently, immigration and emigration. So I say in-migration and exit migration, and that reminds me of what the first letter should be. So the people who are coming in are new, just like people being born, and the people who are exiting are leaving, just like the people who are dying. And so remember it that way, the in and the exit, and make sure that you associate it with the correct term. Then we combine that into our equation, and we've got births plus the in migration minus deaths plus the exit migration. Now, if you are given a question like this on the FRQ, here is something that you have to remember, is that this is a rate. And typically, they'll give it to us out of 1,000. They'll say the birth rate is, and that means out of 1,000. But in this situation, they're going to tell us something different. Our population has 10,000 individuals. We have 100 births, 50 deaths, 10 migrants who are coming in, and 100 who are exiting. So how would we calculate this birth rate? Well, the first thing to do is pretty simple. We're going to put in the births plus the people coming in. So we've got 100 minus these 10 folks right here coming in. So this number ends up being 110 minus your deaths and your exiters. I've got 50 deaths and 100 exiters minus 150. 110 minus 150. So you can see right there that we've got a negative number and we've got a negative 40. But that negative 40 is not a rate. To make it a rate, we have to divide by the population. So you see it right there in red. Divide by that 10,000 number. Now you've got an actual rate. If we wanted to have a percent, then you're going to multiply it by 100. Okay, so now you've got a percent instead of a rate. Because again, our rate was out of 10,000. That's how we're going to do it. So here's another question regarding math of population. If the growth rate is 1% and the population size is 10,000, how many years will it take to have a population of 40,000? First thing to remember is your equation for doubling time. And the equation for that is 70 divided by rate. And that rate should be listed as a percentage. And you don't need to do anything to it. You just do 70 divided by 1. It takes 70 years to double. Remember, on the FRQ, they're going to give you easy math. 70 divided by 1 can't be easier than that. So we know it takes 70 years to double. Now the question is, how long until we get to 40,000? And I like to think of these as like our half-life problems in chemistry, because you have to double the population. If you try to just do straight division here and do 40,000 divided by 10,000, you're going to be wrong. So write it out on scratch paper. It doesn't take but 2 seconds. If I've got 10,000 people now, then after I double once, I'll be 20,000. That's taken 70 years. Now another 70 years passes, and I'm going to double again. And so that second doubling time, I go up to 40,000. So how long did that take? It took 140 years. So again, think of it like a half-life. It's a lot easier if you go about it that way. Okay, 140 years. Remember, if this was an FRQ question, you would have to show your work if they asked it multiple choice, and that's very certainly a possibility. This one did not take very long to work out. They might ask it there. You wouldn't show your work, but on an FRQ, you must always show your work. What they have done here is a perfect example. All right, demographic transition. Here we go. You need to make sure you remember the phases. You need to know their names, honestly, which aren't on here. And you should know what's going on with birth rate, death rate, and population growth as a whole, and why. So that's a lot going on with this graph. So let's start out in phase 1. This is what we had discussed as being the pre-industrial phase. And in the pre-industrial, you have both high birth rates and high death rates. And the reason for that is it's a fairly primitive society. You're living an agricultural lifestyle, an agrarian lifestyle, and there aren't a whole lot of resources available in terms of food, medicine, and you need child labor as well. So we've got a lot of need for births, and we've got a high amount of deaths. The population stays fairly steady, though, because not a lot of people are making it all the way. Think about your survivorship curves and how that's changed even since the 1900s in 100 years. Okay, so then in phase 2, we're in pre-industrial, and it says on this graph that we've got an epidemiological transition. Now what's happening is that the death rate has fallen because we've got better medicine, we have better food production, and so those things are going to help us to live longer, make sure that we have a lot of success, which means that we're going to be making it, more people are going to be making it into their reproductive years. Well, the birth rate is still very high, And so we have this lag, this demographic trap that occurs, because right here you see that at the end of phase 2 you have immense birth rate compared to your death rate. So that population growth is astronomical. In phase 3, this is when we're starting to get to the Industrial Revolution, and or I'm sorry, it doesn't have to be that time period, but when countries start to industrialize, then their birth rate is going to fall. It's a lot harder to have children that are in the city. You don't need them for the labor on the farm. It's expensive to feed them. We also start to get a change in medicine as far as contraceptives, and so that change is going to reduce the birth rate. And then in the final phase, you have stability, and even to the point where you have your birth rate fall below your death rate and you can go into negative growth. But this is because we have finally had our birth rate catch up with our death rate, and so everything has stabilized. So again, what's going on as countries develop? First, the death rate falls, then the birth rate. The reasons why the death rate drops in phase 2: medical care, nutrition, technology. Then, later on, the births drop. Birth control, education of women, lower mortality rate for infants, and less child labor. So we don't need as many kids, and we have the choice of whether we want to have the kids or not in phase 3. Well, how do you tell what's a developed versus a developing country? Well, a developed country has already gone through a demographic transition. Developed countries tend to have better quality of living, better laws, especially regarding environmental conditions like water. So my litmus test is always, can I drink the water? If it's a developed country, I should be able to. Canada, the United States, Australia, England, those are all going to be developed countries. Now, developing countries can't always be safe drinking the water. Maybe in Cancun it's fine, but you go to Mexico City and you're not going to want to do that. And so a developing country like Latin America, China, Africa, those places lack the resources, the infrastructure to really have a good success and to make it out of the demographic trap so that their population can stabilize. So what we see is that a fifth of the world's population is living in absolute poverty. They're illiterate, they lack clean water, and don't have enough food. 80% of the world's population lives in the developing countries, and that number is growing because their birth rate is still much higher than their death rate, as opposed to the rest of the world that's developed, where we have slowed our population growth. So the developing countries are more and more people. But remember, they're not necessarily the biggest problem. Even though we have a much smaller population, we use way more resources than they do. Fertility rates. So let's remember these terms. Total fertility is the average number of children that a woman will have. And so it could be 2 if that woman has 2 children, but another woman in that same country could have 6. And so we need to average it, and that's the only thing that really makes sense. If you went around telling people that in America we have a total fertility rate of 19, you would look crazy. But Miss Duggar certainly does have a very high fertility rate for her. That's why we need to do the average. It gives us a better picture of what's really going on in the country. A fertility rate of 2.0 would be the replacement level fertility. Under 2, you would have a shrinking population, and over 2, you would have a growing population. Now, I say it would be because that's if every single child survived to reproduce, but that's not what we see. And so for developed countries, because there's a little bit of infant death, or it doesn't even have to be infant, but before adolescence and before puberty, definitely before reproduction. So we need to have about 2.1 children for replacement level. And for developing countries, it needs to be higher than that, 2.6 or more, because they have a much higher infant mortality level. Remember that we don't want to have a shrinking population, because a shrinking population also means a shrinking economy, and that puts a lot of pressure for the working class to take care of a retiring older generation. Good reason why any of you guys should consider a career in geriatrics. Moving on to the World Bank. The World Bank is a special agency of the United Nations that gets money from those who have and loans it to those who have not. So the developed countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, we're going to pool together money. The United Nations requires it of us for participation, and we loan it to the developing countries. So the World Bank is that agency in charge of deciding who's going to get the money and for what types of projects. In an advanced environmental class, you would hear a lot more talk about the World Bank. They used to be in the news quite a bit because a lot of their practices are looked down upon by people who are real, I'll say, real vigorous environmentalists, because there are a lot of times when the loans to these countries backfire. They can't pay them off, and all that happens is their debt increases, and now they are even more indebted to the richer countries. Again, this is for all types of issues. It's usually not environmental issues. Typically, the World Bank is funding things like electricity, roads, new technology. These are really infrastructures that will help the country to get out of their demographic trap and lead them into the industrialized or even post-industrial society. Now, one of the interesting things not brought up on here is that some countries have decided to work through the World Bank in a debt for nature swap. And that's the name of the program, Debt for Nature. Costa Rica did this, and what they decided is that instead of paying off some of these loans that they couldn't, they decided that they would make these global preserves. Instead of a national park, it would really be more of a global care system for their rainforest. And so that has worked incredibly well for Costa Rica. Their ecotourism dollars are way up. They have a lot of scientists going down there. It's helped out their university system. And so the idea of protecting nature and getting paid to do that, or being able to pay off your loans by doing that, was an incredible program created for these nations that are developing by the World Bank. So again, they catch some flack because we don't want to see a country get into more debt because they've gotten a loan from the World Bank. But it has worked, and so it will continue to be a presence. Now, in our book, this is really chapter 14, and there's not a whole lot about soil in your book, and so that's why we had to add a lot. If you're looking for research on soils, go back to your packets, not to your textbook. But I want you guys to look at the soil profile here for a minute. We've got the OA, EBC horizons. Remember that if we add the R, if you ever see that on the test, the R is going to be beneath the C. This picture is not drawn the way that we like to see it drawn either. The O horizon, when you read that description, says surface litter and decomposing plant material. That really should be on top. And so we talk about the O horizon being what you see when you look down. A place like the desert does not have a O horizon. There's not leaves sitting on top. There's not decomposing plant material. Even a place like the rainforest, those things get used up so quickly, they're not really going to have an O horizon. Where you're going to see it the most is a deciduous forest where you have leaves that fall every year. They sit, they decompose, and then they become part of the soil. So the top layer of soil is the A horizon, and that's what we call topsoil. That should be the layer that looks nice and black and rich. So topsoil up at the top layer, that's going to be our primary layer of importance for things like our crops. And one of the reasons why the grasslands is such a great place to grow is over years and years of fire disturbances, they have built up a very rich horizon of topsoil. Now, E is right below that. Again, sometimes we include the E in the A because what's really going on here is it tells you it's called the zone of leaching. Well, the real word for it is eluviation with an E. And that eluviation, just like with migration, the E stands for exit. And so we've got the exiting of nutrients from the A horizon. Coincidentally, the B horizon, it says accumulation of leach materials. We've also seen it looked at in our book in previous years' editions as the alluviation with an I, the alluviation layer, because you've got nutrients coming in. So the E horizon and the B horizon have that in common. Nutrients are exiting in E, and they're coming in into B. Didn't need a letter for it because they just call it B. So we were labeling them, but the E is sort of like that little tiny area at the bottom of the A where the nutrients are being leached out. It typically has a bleached out type of whitish color to it. And then you go down to B. C is going to be weathered parent material, partly broken down minerals. And again, if you go down one more, you're going to be in the R horizon, which is the regolith, and that's the bedrock. That's the solid, not broken down. What exactly are we sitting on top of? Think about Stone Mountain, and that for 2 miles around the mountain, it stretches out. And if you were to dig down deep enough, you would hit that granite mountain rock. Now we distinguish the types of soil based on their size. And so the largest of the sizes of soil is sand. And when we go above that, it's going to be things like gravel, and gravel gets broken down by size as well. Gravel, rocks, boulders, everything is size driven in this geology realm. But our largest particles of soil, again, is sand. We can see that in this picture right here. Silt is next, and then clay, clay being the smallest. Now think about it this way. When I rub grains of sand, I can feel the individual grains, just like if they were crystals of salt. But with clay, when I rub clay between my fingers, it feels smooth, or especially if I'm dealing with wet clay like a pottery class, it even might feel sticky. And so that's an indication that we cannot feel the individual particle sizes. And then if you've been playing in sand, you can clean yourself off by simply brushing off your hands. If you've been playing in clay, then that clay is going to stick to your hands, and it's going to be embedded in all of the little pores in your fingerprints and all that. So that gives us an idea again of the size of the particles. Now when we look at what that really means for the physical characteristics of the soil, when we have sand, because those particles are so large, it means that we have a large amount of what they're going to call percolation and leaching. That was what we said was permeability. Okay, so it's able to permeate down, water flows through it very easily. Whereas with clay, there's a lot of blocks that it has to pass by, and so it's harder for water to find its route down. And so that means we have a low permeability. However, the porosity, the amount of spaces that can capture and trap the water with clay is very high, and with sand is very low. So the things to remember are the particle size, which one is the biggest, which is sand, which one's the smallest, clay, and then you need to remember your porosity and permeability and be able to put those in order as well. Silt's right there in the center, and so we really don't focus on silt. It's just between all the rest of it. Okay, but the best type of soil to use for growing plants, especially we talked about soil in relation to crops, so the best thing we can have is a loamy soil, because all of those are good things. The sand has that high permeability. Too much though, and you can't grow anything. Clay has that high porosity. It's going to hold the water very well. But again, too much of it and you'll drown out your plants. And so we want a basic mixture of the three. You'll see though it's less for the clay because a little clay goes a long way. And so again, your loam is going to be down here at about 40, 40, 20. Okay. Now, we've got different classes of soil, not something that we went into, not something that our book talks about at all, but if you want to take a look through this list real quickly, mollisols are fertile, dark, temperate grasslands, best agricultural soil, deep A horizon. So just like I had said before, when you've got a grassland that's burned and you've had turnover year after year, you get a buildup of good nutrients in that A horizon. Oxisols are what we see in tropical and subtropical rainforests. We've got a lot of iron and aluminum oxides. In the B horizon, there's not much of an O horizon at all. Alphasols, weathered forest soil, not deep, but developed OA and E, and the B, typical of temperate forest biomes. So that would be what we would have here. Arid soils, drylands, deserts, they lack vegetation, they lack rain, and so it says that it's unstructured vertically. Irrigation leads to salinization because there's high evaporation. So you've got, again, a basic understanding now of if you saw those words. I've not seen them before in an AP exam, have seen them in a geology class. Okay, chapter 9 goes into water and what our water looks like. And so something to remember is that the Earth's water supply is mostly going to be salt water, which leaves only a little bit accessible for us. And of that 2.5% that is fresh, we can't even use most of it. 1.7% is in polar ice caps and glaciers. Now, if you're saying, but it's all going to melt, well, that won't actually get us any more, because then it'll become salt water. It's going to run off into the oceans. But out of that 2.5% of fresh water, we only have 0.77% that's accessible for us that we can use and get to. So some water facts. Remember that the biggest use of water is agriculture. In our homes, we're primarily using water to wash, clean, and flush. Not the cooking, not the drinking, the things that water is essential to life for. And that's why water conservation becomes such a big issue, because if we can cut down on the amount it takes to wash, clean, and flush, then we're saving a large amount of water. But the biggest thing we could do is have agriculture cut back by being smart and efficient in irrigation techniques. The typical person in an industrialized nation uses 700 to 1,000 gallons per week. And so imagine if you had to carry that back and forth from the grocery store, or heaven forbid you didn't have a car and you had to actually walk down to the stream, get your water and bring it back. So you can kind of get an idea of why we use a lot more. Sorry about that. You can get an idea of why we use so much more water in industrialized nations. It's a lot easier. Water is very helpful. It's a universal solvent. We use it in industry. We use it in our homes. We use it in agriculture. It's necessary for just about everything we do, but we need to be mindful because we're polluting it and we're overusing it. So again, some effects that we have on the water cycle, and Miss Settles did her screencast too. If you want to see more in depth about the water cycle, you can go there. But some of the things that you will see is that we see pollution coming from landfills. You see also agricultural runoff going into streams. That's going to lead to eutrophication. You've got a factory giving you air pollution, which comes down again as acid rain. So all of these things get connected in our hydrologic cycle. And what we are doing, besides just drawing out too much water and besides just polluting it, is that we are not thinking about the fact that with 7 billion people on the planet, water is a resource that eventually we could have fights over. And so if you're curious about that, go to the documents that our student created and look up some of those case studies that we did about water wars. Remember, water is going to be a very big player in the future. All right, circulation and convection cells. I like this picture fine, whatever, but what I really think is awesome about convection cells is how often they come up in AP Environmental Science. We see them here, and this is probably the easiest place to look at them and talk about them. What we see with this convection cell is that when we are near the equator, we have our hottest temperatures, and remember also that as we go up in the atmosphere, the temperature is going to decrease. So the hottest place on the earth really should be right here at 0 degrees and near the surface. Whoops, sorry about that. Now, as the air heats up, we know from our chemistry class that it's going to expand and it's going to become less dense, and so it's going to rise up. Well, while it rises up, it's going to take the moisture with it. Think about any humidity, which means the moisture content of the air. That's going to go up as well. But when it gets higher in the atmosphere, it's going to start to condense as it cools down, and then it's going to fall as rain. This is why the rainforest is located where it is. So we don't think about the rainforest as being as hot as a desert, but it's getting rained on and it's got cloud cover for a lot of the parts of the day. It's incredibly humid though. But again, so this air is going to cool down, it's going to drop its moisture, and then it's going to fall down at 30 degrees latitude. 30 degrees is where we've got our deserts, both north and south of the equator. That air, again, just comes right on back, and this is where we get our circulation cells from. The ones closest to the equator are the Hadleys. The next ones are the Ferals, and then at the ends you've got the polars. Okay, next slide, we're looking at a rain shadow effect, and this rain shadow is similar to what we would see in Seattle, Washington, where you've got an ocean breeze bringing in moisture from the ocean over the land. As that moisture and that wind works its way up because of the physical barrier of the mountain, it is also going to cool down and condense and drop its moisture. Heavy air can't go very far, so that water has to come out so the air can continue to move. And that's why we've got a rainy Seattle, but on the other side of the state of Washington, you have a very, very dry landscape. And that's called the leeward side. The side towards the wind, windward, away is the leeward. A little bit more about water when we're talking about our groundwater. The largest reserve that we have is the Ogallala Aquifer, and you can see that's right around the same region where the Dust Bowl was the worst. And this is the, I'd say, the crux of our breadbasket for the United States. Yeah, there's a lot of farming also in Iowa, Missouri, but you've got the Mississippi running down there as a potential source, and you've got a lot of streams coming in. But for Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, this becomes a huge source of water where farmers can drill their wells and they can pump that out. But the problem is we've been pumping out so much that we have a shortage of water and we're having to drill deeper pumps. You worry about things like subsidence, but it's not the type of subsoil geography that you're going to have the massive sinkholes like we've seen in Guatemala City and that type of thing. Now, you will need to know a few case studies. Sometimes they'll throw a random one out there that you've never heard of before. The case studies we talked about, we did talk about Three Gorges. We talked about the Aral Sea. This slide talks about Mono Lake. Mono Lake is in California. And what happened here is that the water was diverted for the city of Los Angeles. And they thought that they were just going to, take a little bit, but the city of Los Angeles takes a lot of water. And so the evaporation rate increased as there was less water in the lake, and the temperatures were able to get higher because of less volume. And so the salt concentration kept going up. And basically you end up with a salt bed instead of having an actual lake. Again, just like what we saw with the Aral Sea, but that stuff is happening in the United States as well. Three Gorges Dam in China, we talked about, they built it for a source of power. It's about 2 miles long and it sits on top of a seismic fault. It's incredibly heavy. It's already got cracks. To make that reservoir, they had to flood thousands and thousands of acres, and that's people and animals that lost their homes and their habitats. So there's a huge environmental impact. Also, as the vegetation starts to decay, you have a huge release of methane from that decomposition. And we worry about if the dam were ever to break, you would not just have the people who are displaced, you would have loss of life. And so we do worry a lot about Three Gorges Dam and what it might mean for the future in China. Okay, chapter 10 looked at food, and we actually looked a lot more at food than the book does because it's such an interesting and timely topic for you. But remember that food affects our air, our soil, and our water. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about these as we go on, but just briefly, air, we've got emissions from fossil fuel use because we've got tractors and those types of things. You see fossil fuels again for other air pollutants, and pesticide sprays. With the water, you've got the aquifer depletion I just mentioned, runoff and flooding from the land that's been cleared. It no longer has the forest and the stoppage ability of a natural system. You get fish kills from not only the pesticides, but also the fertilizers, and those lead to pollution as well. Remember that nitrogen in ammonia or in nitrate fertilizers can lead to blue baby syndrome, and so that's very problematic. And again, I mentioned the eutrophication from, again, the fertilizers. Now for the soil, we get erosion. We've done a lot to help maintain and preserve those issues. Definitely you want to go back and look at the, I believe it's going to be in the water PowerPoint that Ms. Settles has posted, but she's going to talk about some of the different methods of irrigation that will help to slow down erosion and runoff and those types of things. You've got loss of fertility of the soil, which we turn to fertilizers. You've got salinization, we talked about that. The thing that you do to fix salinization is you pour more water on the surface, and so that leads to waterlogging. And then we get eventual desertification, where you become like a desert because of the lack of fertility, the lack of productivity. Okay, major environmental effects of food production. You also have a loss of biodiversity because you've lost habitat. You have fish that are being killed because of those pesticides and even because of the fertilizers and eutrophication. You kill wild predators to protect your livestock. We talked in my class about the loss of the prairie dogs because they weren't even predators, but they were hurting the cattle. And so by killing off the prairie dogs, the black-footed ferret suffered as well. You've also seen that with the devastation of our country's large cat populations. We used to have mountain lions in many, many parts of the U.S., and we've seen the reduction in the wolf populations as well. You also see the loss of genetic diversity because these monoculture strains are coming in and blowing their pollen, blowing their genetic information into our wild crops, and that eventually will weaken the overall species from being able to come back from maybe a new invasive type of disease or pest. Now, human health, mentioned the nitrates already, and that could cause blue baby syndrome. Also, we're starting to learn a lot more about why we should be concerned about pesticides in our food, on our food, in our drinking water, and in the air. We also have contamination with the disease-causing organisms, those fecal coliforms, from livestock waste, especially from our CAFOs. Now, the Green Revolution was a fantastic event in terms of increasing the amount of food that we had on the planet in an attempt to eliminate hunger. And that really was the goal back in the 1960s. We wanted to feed more people. Thomas Malthus, remember, had predicted that we were going to overshoot our ability to feed everybody. But we figured out how to make food resources increase exponentially through the Green Revolution. And so you cannot say that the Green Revolution is all bad, because what it does is give us more food for more people. But the things that people get on about the Green Revolution you've got new crop cultivars. Some of these are genetically modified. In the very beginnings, we're going to do more of an artificial selection, but we're going to make plants more drought resistant. We're going to make bigger ears of corn. We're going to make corn that can flower or come to fruit multiple times per year or even per season. You also increase the irrigation requirements, fertilizer, pesticide, and you increase the need for mechanization, and that increases the amount of fossil fuels that we're going to use. So we talk about this as high yield agriculture, but it's also high input agriculture. You've got to have a lot of money to do all of these different things. So the result of the Green Revolution, we still have famine, but I'll be honest, that's not the fault of the Green Revolution. That's the fault of governments and corrupt countries. Our population is still increasing, so we still need more and more food. We have increased the cost of production through the Green Revolution. It's had a negative environmental impact, and it didn't work for everyone. Again, it did work, but it's not the ultimate solution. We can really do things that are a little bit different because of where we are. We have some of the best agricultural land in the entire world. So we can go to more organic farming methods and still have a high enough yield to feed everybody that we need to feed. In chapter 11 and 12, and in our book, again, this is different. It's more like chapter 9 and 10 talk about protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. We discussed before we went to the zoo that a threatened species is in danger of becoming endangered species. An endangered species is one that is likely to go extinct in the near future. So the lesser of the two is the threatened, and the greater is the endangered. Okay, something else that we need to be concerned about from a biodiversity standpoint, we looked at this when we talked about uses of biodiversity, is that nature helps to provide for us cures for diseases, and approximately 25% of pharmaceuticals have come from native natural sources. And while we continue to make man-made drugs, we still return to nature to find new compounds that could be effective in treating different diseases. Another thing that we talked about the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, and there were a lot of bird deaths. Again, this is a little bit old of a PowerPoint. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a huge biodiversity issue that you need to worry about. That I would talk about more in oil. But again, biodiversity, think about the things we did at the zoo. This was very recent for us, so I'm not going to cover very much about it. So as far as endangered species go, you want to be able to know some animals that are endangered, why they're endangered, and what's being done about them. So this example, or this slide right here, has some examples that this teacher, this is Dr. G, she used with her class. Now I'm going to tell you, though, about some that I think that you should know. The first one that I would want you to know is about the black-footed ferret. We talked about how it was a success story for conservation. We talked about how the eradication of the prairie dog in the farming and cattle ranching areas was what led to its demise. And so that's a success story. It's also just a really neat sort of look at predator-prey interactions and some other things. Another story that we were talking about was the California condor and how the lead bullets used for hunting were contaminating the condor's diet. So if it would find a deer that had been shot and left by a hunter who couldn't get to it, the condors were eating that, getting lead poisoning, and dying. And so again, another success story. What they did was to go in and they did clutching. They took eggs from the nests, raised them in captivity with hand puppets and the whole 9 yards so that they could re-release those into the wild. So those are two of the stories that I know that I told in class. You can pick your favorites and know more about them. But again, endangered species, you want to make sure you've got something that you can pull out as an FRQ response if they asked you about an endangered species. But it's very hard for them to ask specific questions on the multiple choice. Won't put it past them. They do ask some weird and random stuff, and it's just luck of the draw if we've talked about it or not. And that is the end of part 2.